Now I'd like to talk about the governmental funds statements. So in order to get those government-wide statements, we take numbers from our funds, right? So each of the three main categories of funds has its own set of statements: governmental, proprietary, and fiduciary. So we'll take a look real quickly at the governmental funds balance sheet, we call it. And if you'll look at this, you'll see assets, liabilities, and the remainder, which we'll call the fund balance. So it's not exactly like a balance sheet. There's no owner's equity. There's no stockholders' equity, but it does work in a similar way. And depending on how many funds there are within the government, you'll have different columns. You could conceive of some types of government having many more columns. A very small government might only have the general fund. All right, so of course columns, and of course there's always a total column, and the total column is what is eventually reconciled and brought over to the government-wide statements. If you flip over and look at page 35, you'll see we have a separate statement of funds, which gets reconciled over to the government-wide statement of activities. But as you can see, it's got revenues and expenditures, not expenses, right? But it's similar to an income statement. And you'll have columns for each type of fund. And this city has general, special revenue, courthouse renovation, and debt service. So you're depending on what statement you look at, you're going to see a variety of columns, but you'll always have at least a general fund, even if it's a very small town. All right, and of course, this has to be reconciled to accrual-based accounting, so you will always have a reconciliation. And this number is what you're going to eventually see over here, right? So that those get added up into the government-wide. All right, so let's talk about proprietary funds. All right, so here's proprietary funds, statement of net position on 37. So it's somewhat like the balance sheet for just the proprietary funds. Remember, proprietary funds are things that kind of operate like a separate business. So in this city, they have water, solid waste, parking, and of course you have a total column. Your assets, your liabilities, and not owner's equity, but net position. And so these numbers go over to the government-wide along with the numbers from the governmental, and that's how we create those statements. And like governmental funds, we do have a sort of a income statement with your revenues and operating expenses, a column for each business. You may see different. Some cities have electric companies. Some cities have, separate columns for other businesses. They might run a ball stadium, something like that. So keep in mind that's how that works. Finally, we haven't really looked at yet. Here's the statement of cash flows for proprietary funds. We'll talk about that in the future, but just like any business, you can calculate the cash flows through it. If you look, you'll see the biggest difference between this and any other cash flow statement is we have two separate financing activities. We break out the non-capital and capital cash flows. All right, and of course it's by fund. So you may have several of these. You may have more depending on what kinds of separate businesses a city runs. But the proprietary fund's the only one that gets a cash flow statement. All right, so don't worry about that for anything else. But proprietary funds, it makes sense because those are like businesses. And finally, finally, we have the statements for the fiduciary fund. So these are separate. They don't get consolidated into the government-wide statements. Why? Because they don't belong to the government. So if you look at this statement of net position, you'll see there's assets, liabilities, and the net position. And depending on what kind of trust they have, so here's an employee pension fund, right? So that's one kind of trust. Here's a private purpose trust. Depending on what people have given money for, there could be some kind of a school trust, a library trust. So you'd have a different column for each kind of thing held in trust for other entities. And just the net position, right? Assets minus liabilities equals net position. And of course, additions and deductions. So you don't really have revenues and expenses, but you would. Let's say the pension fund invests in some bonds and some stocks. They might have some earnings from those. And of course, you're going to pay out, right? If it's a pension fund, you have to pay the retirees their benefits, things like that. So you do have money that comes in and money that goes out of the trust, and a change in the net position. All right, so that's it for fund statements. You should now at this point be ready to go on and look at those homeworks. Good luck.